Crunching the wheels on the high dry grass, the field drove up to the rusty metal gate. Max looked back at the sweet couple who were sleeping, hugging each other in the back seat, and shook his head with a grin. "Stalkers, damn it," he muttered, trying not to make noise, and got out of the car. Weeds clung helplessly to the tight khaki trousers and crunched under the thick soles of heavy trekking boots. Stretching on the move, the guy walked up to the gate and pulled the sash. It swayed lazily, with a dull clank of the rusty chain that connected the doors. The lock on the chain was torn off a long time ago, and now it was casually wound by someone just for the sake of decency. Max unwound and discarded the chain, took hold of the bars of the left sash and pulled. She lifelessly scraped a couple of centimeters and got stuck in the weeds. The rusted and sagged metal pole has long been tired of holding it in the air. Taking a more comfortable position and trying to keep his back straight, the guy crouched down a little and, with a grunt, lifted the casually welded reinforcement grate above the ground. The sash, creaking, obeyed. Max with a strong jerk moved it by a dozen centimeters at once, breaking and crushing the grass. He shifted his legs, strained and jerked again. And one more thing, until it became clear that the left side of the field freely passes by. The sash clanked and creaked in protest, but could not oppose anything with a healthy, strong muscle. "Oh, yeah." Max exhaled, catching his breath and straightening up. "How good I am. How powerful my paws are." The dark-haired guy's paws were really powerful, and his whole figure evoked vague associations with Vikings. Tall, with a naturally powerful physique, he did not launch himself and looked very impressive. Grow a beard, braid braids, dress appropriately. The main thing is not to forget the horned helmet and even now go to the set for the role of some Ragnar. The second leaf soon suffered the fate of the first, and the way was opened. The gray three-story box of the old building towered among the neglected overgrown garden hundreds of meters ahead. He looked promising. Max excitedly rubbed his hands, brushing the rust off them, and climbed into the car. "Hey, Sid and Nancy." Without turning around, he called out to the friends sleeping in the back seat and carefully led Neva through the gate. The rise, of course. From the back seat, there was a sleepy scuffling and muffled moaning. "Damn, I'm all numb. How long did we drive? It's already light. 3 o'clock, as I said, at 7 in the morning. The whole day is ahead. You're fucking pepalats, Max, I've served my leg. I told you, I should have driven a normal car. Is that your sleek automaton a normal car?" The driver laughed merrily. "He would have sat on his belly 10 kilometers from here, I'm telling you for sure. No, you can't get to a good abandonment in a family car. The road was laid like a plow. As soon as we got off the highway, I was more on the side of the road. Okay, at least Palia is here. I don't remember anything. I overslept everything. I told you to get some sleep. What the hell were you doing half the night?" "They were embroidering with a cross," the girl answered in a hoarse sleepy voice. "Pash, give me some water." Max, grinning good-naturedly, turned the car around on an overgrown wasteland that had once been a yard, and stopped at the concrete steps of the porch hidden in the grass. "Well, that's it, we arrived," went to look around. One by one, the passengers got out of the car. Pavel groaned and limped across the wasteland, stretching his cramped leg. The girl remained standing near the open car, wrapped in a denim jacket and shivering. The Viking slowly gathered his long, slightly curly, coarse hair into a ponytail and patted the pockets and pockets of his tight pants, checking if everything was in place. "What was there?" the girl asked, looking around the facade. "Didn't Pashka tell you, or what?" Max turned to her. "Pavel, did you take the girl into the unknown at night? I hope you didn't promise her kebabs and a beach? I just didn't tell you everything you were saying there. Len, I told you about the abandoned school. I remember about school, but it's somehow." Lena shrugged her shoulders. "There is not a single village like nearby. Where is the school from? And it's not a school. The tall guy looked reproachfully at his limping friend. Pavlik, as always, listened to half, forgot half. There was something like a boarding school or an orphanage. The residential building is a little further away, but it was demolished. There's nothing to see there now, it seems to me. Then we'll take a look. And here is really an academic building, but it's hard to call it a school. Boarding school for whom? Yes, you can figure it out now, Max shrugged. And what's the difference? The chorus is royal. The royal mansions stared sullenly at the newcomers with dark gaps in the windows. The brick walls, once made of white bricks, have now lost their whiteness and neat appearance, have gone dark streaks and cracks. The double doors, to which the crumbled concrete steps of the porch rose from the grass, were a rectangle of solid rust, darkened with time. Pavel, whose leg finally came to life, came up behind the girl, hugged and kissed her neck. Lena smiled timidly, not taking her eyes off the gloomy building. Yes, it's romantic here. I told you, you shouldn't have come with us. Max and I are familiar and crazy on abandonments, especially Max, and why would you do that? No, I'm also interested. She shook her blonde hair, which after sleeping in the car came into disarray, which only added to her prettiness. What are we going to do there? So this is the plan, the tall driver turned to them busily. Now we are going to explore. We go in, look around, go around the first floor, maybe the second. And if we realize that the building is about to collapse on our heads, we get in the car and drive away. I may be crazy, but I'm not going to risk my own or your skins. And if everything is smooth, then we go back to the car, have a snack, take lanterns, tools, and do this stuff seriously. We inspect the offices, take interesting pictures, look for a souvenir for memory. Tetanus, for example, Lena agreed. By the way, in case my head is split by a suddenly fallen piano, Max began poking his fingers into the pockets of his pants closed with flaps. Remember, the car keys are here, a knife is here, a tourniquet and a bandage are here, sterile napkins are here, a flashlight is here, documents are here, a phone is here. Remember? Yes, Pavel lied for two. Let's go already. Yes, let's go. Shut the doors. Up close, the doors looked even more unpresentable than at a distance. Rust has eaten into the metal and absorbed it completely. Max took hold of the metal handle and pulled. The door held surprisingly tight. Maybe with her foot? Pavel suggested it. And it opens outwards, the Viking answered doubtfully, studying the door. But it seems to be rusty. Maybe I'll rip it off the hinges or take out the lock. Let me try. He stepped back a little, glanced from under his brows at the unjustified barrier and delivered a crushing kick. Pasha, who had seen quite impressive doors fly out more than once from such a blow, even winced. He half expected that his stern friend would just punch a hole in the rusty iron. The door hooted, slightly giving in, and rust sprayed out of the cracks near the brickwork in clouds, but it resisted. Max stamped his broken foot and glared at the door. Ah! He grumbled. No, I can't stand this one. It's only rusty on the outside, but inside it looks like tank armor. We won't go in here. Plan B? Yeah, as far as I remember, a building like the letter N. The Viking ran his finger over the rust, drawing contours. The main entrance is here, in the middle of a long stick. There's a kind of hall, a corridor there, and in the far short wing a gym with access to the street. So now we'll go around the main wing on the right and try the gym door. They went around. The tall leader walked ahead, mercilessly trampling hard grass and dry stems of some weeds with thick-soled boots. They tried to scratch their legs in response, but to no avail. Pavel and Lena followed. Sneakers and jeans coped quite well with the already broken prickly jungle. How does he know all this? The girl asked in a whisper, looking at the broad back of Max who had gone ahead. Well, about the layout and boarding school. Well, I told you that he's crazy on the abandoned, digs info wherever possible, looking for interesting. First he'll find out everything thoroughly, and then he'll go. When we studied at uni, we often went together, now only occasionally. Then I have a job, then he's off somewhere completely in the wilds. Don't think about it, he only looks like that. His head is boiling, wow. He's like the head of the development department at some firm now. This is a field only for trips to places like this, and for the city he has another car. Well done. And they hurried after Max, who somehow went too far ahead. And if it's closed there, then what, will we break the windows? The girl called out to him. Mademoiselle. The Viking replied without turning around. We are not vandals, but serious researchers. We won't break windows. We will only break one thing, Pavel explained, smiling. Let's choose one that has nothing left to lose, and make a door out of it. But I don't think it will come to that. Max confidently stated. Why would I? Of course, we didn't go around the whole building, but not on the facade, not here. He pointed to the courtyard between the two wings of the building they were passing. There are no shattered windows. There were some vandals here, of course, the windows were broken in places, but there are no holes so that a person could get through. So, they came in somewhere. I told you, the head, Pavel chuckled. The gym door was at the end of a short wing and looked no less rusty and dilapidated than the front entrance. Max studied her uncertainly, already knowing about the deceptiveness of appearance. Well, theoretically, there's another door, in the kitchen, at the other end, he drawled thoughtfully. But it's definitely closed, such doors are always locked. Okay, let's try. The door responded to a tentative jerk for the metal bracket, which served as a handle here, with a strained creak and, opening a couple of centimeters, immediately slammed shut with a clang. So, excitedly looked around Max. It's tight, but it's coming. Grabbing the bracket with both hands, he pulled with all his strength. Muscles bulged on his back and shoulders, the door groaned and creaked open. Jerk after jerk, the Viking pulled back the desperately resisting door until he won a gap from it enough for a person to crawl through. Come on! He panted, desperately fighting with the door, which for some reason was struggling to close. Well, inside, I'll follow. Pavel and Lena hurriedly squeezed into the gloomy gym. The guy hurriedly leaned on the door from the inside, and Max slid into the opening. The sash, sensing weakness, immediately threw off a less powerful opponent and slammed shut with a clang that echoed under the high arches, for some reason reminding the girl of bear traps. The door frame shook, several pieces of plaster fell off the wall and scattered on the floor into fine dust. Your mother. The puffing big man squeezed out with feeling. Who thought of putting such a spring on the door? He approached and puzzledly tried to pull the spring with his finger. You might as well have tried to pull the crowbar off. Yes, we have seriously approached the problem of drafts. Or has she lost her flexibility from time to time? Then it's strange that it didn't break, Pavel noticed, rubbing his shoulder. Maybe our predecessors decided to make a joke. Max shrugged and waved his hand. Funny. Well, then they obviously left by another way, Lena noticed. There is an easier entrance somewhere. Reasonably, the Viking agreed. But we are not looking for easy ways. Okay, the main thing is we're inside. We'll find a way out while we can look around. The gym was 2 stories high, the high windows were tightened from the inside by a metal mesh that once protected them from sword strikes. Directly in front of the newcomers was a rack bolted to the floor with bars, under which brown baggy mats were piled up. Wooden shields with basketball rings once hung on the walls at both ends of the hall, but the wood did not stand the test of time, and the rings now lay on the floor, and the shields themselves cracked and skewed. There was a wooden door on the left, which probably closed the closet with inventory. A volleyball net, miraculously preserved, hung across the hall. Near the windows on the right lay several more mats, and on them towered an incomprehensible shaggy pile. Lena gasped and reached for Pashka. What's that? she asked cautiously. Rope. Max had almost regained his breath. Decayed and broke under its own weight. It's all too decayed here, Pavel drawled thoughtfully, hugging the girl. How long did you say everything was abandoned here? 50 years, maybe more. There was not much accurate information. Pash, did you really tell the girl about the nuances of our travels with you? She looks really scared right at the start. Lena turned around, expecting to see pity or even contempt on the stern Viking's face, but he was looking at her with concern. Yes, I know about these. Lena twirled her palm in the air. Paranormal research, haunted houses and all this. Pavlik told me. And? The big man raised his eyebrows. Well, I laughed, the girl confessed. But here it is somehow perceived differently. Don't worry, I won't panic, I'm terribly curious myself. Well, it's also a little scary, everything is like that. Yeah, Pavel agreed and went to the volleyball net. I wonder what condition the swords are in. Maybe we can play volleyball? He jerked the lower cable with his finger, and it immediately broke. The net trembled, somehow almost palpably gasped and began to spread out before my eyes, leaving thin threads of dust in the air. After a couple of seconds, the upper cable also snapped with a barely audible crack. The remains of the net fell to the floor with a rustle, turning into a roller of obscure junk. Pavel just stood there with his finger bent, looking at him in a puzzled way. Consider it one, Max summed up. Let's move on. By the way, you're not really jumping on the floor here, who knows what condition the boards are in. Dachshund, here we have an entrance in the locker room, and the exit to the corridor should be at that end. The door was indeed at the end of the hall. This time it's an ordinary wooden one, closed with an English lock. Max did not push his palm hard into the lock area, and the tongue broke the old tree with a crunch. The door swung open. There was a small vestibule behind it, opening onto a platform in front of a cross corridor. On the left there was a staircase up, on the right in the corner there was another wooden door, double-leafed. Oh, there's a canteen there, Pavel confidently declared. At my school, almost everything was the same, only we had 2 floors. Yes, it looks like Max nodded. But this is not a typical project, there are 3 floors and the ceilings are higher than usual. Yeah, well, that's to be expected. He pointed down the corridor. On one side, a pair of doors were visible in the wall, the other opened onto the street with wide windows, and Maxim pointed to them. Less scrupulous researchers of abandoned buildings have obviously tried here. Many windows were broken, window sills and slopes were torn apart in places, pieces of brick were torn out of them, lying in abundance along the corridor. What the hell was that for? He shook his head. Well, at least it's not fucked up. It's not evening yet, Pavel chuckled. Let's go take a look at the main entrance, we'll go straight to the car. What are you looking for here? What ghost? The girl asked almost casually as they walked down the corridor, stepping over pieces of broken bricks. Here is one of the classic, I would say, stories, Max responded. Look, the windows were torn apart, but the doors were not touched. Wow. Yes, so, the story is quite ordinary. All sorts of refuseniks studied here, perhaps disabled to one degree or another, like even street children. Well, the collective is boyish, bullying and all that. Some of the weaker students seem to be locked up in the study for the night, well, and intimidated, they say, to sit and be silent. Well, in the morning they found him in a noose. Wow, Lena said. Yeah, Maxim nodded in the same tone as her. Well, then, most likely, a series of coincidences. Someone fell off the roof, someone, while the essence of the dawdle, opened his veins, someone from the special council got drunk and also somehow managed. In general, there was a legend that the ghost of the hanged man settled here and pulled whom he could to himself. Creepy, but nonsense, of course. However, vagabonds and adventurers were periodically found here later. Also suicide and also hanged. The local version of Aokigahara? Pavel clarified. Yes, if you judge by rumors, then something like. It's interesting, in general, I've heard it for a long time, but I couldn't find all the ends. There was a small playground in front of the main entrance where the children must have changed clothes. On both sides of it are changing rooms with rows of hooks. To the left of the landing, in the corridor, there was a table on which lay an ancient decayed magazine, the purpose of which was no longer possible to determine. The main entrance had 2 double doors. The inner wooden ones were open, one of them had fallen off the upper hinge and was standing askew against the wall. The old dark green paint was breaking off in large scales. The exterior metal doors here were slightly less corroded and in some places kept traces of darkened orange paint. They were closed by a fairly simple metal bolt. Apparently, the watchman was either in the building after closing or still left through the kitchen. Maxim took hold of the L-shaped bolt and pulled the short crossbar towards himself to make it easier to pull, but it did not move. He pulled harder. He struggled with the rusty piece of iron for a few seconds, but soon gave up. Yes, it's welded, probably you can't make it out under the rust. Or it has boiled so that welding is not better to weld. The door in the kitchen and the windows remain. Pavel shrugged his shoulders. Look, what's here? Lena, who had left the mess with the door to the men, was looking with interest at the remains of a magazine on the table, at which, probably, a janitor or a watchman once sat, or maybe both. A half-rotted layer of dark loose paper bulged about in the middle. Her boyfriend came closer while Maxim was trying to somehow move the door, not wanting to cut extra circles. Someone's nest? The girl asked cautiously. Yes, well, there are no holes, rather something is lying. Come on. Pavel pulled the edge of the magazine, and it broke off with a crunch, causing Lena to gasp in surprise. That's an old woman. The guy resolutely took hold of the edges and carefully shifted the crunchy, crumbling crumbs. Oh, Max, we have a jackpot. A golden ball? The Viking strode towards them, shaking the red dust from his palms. No one will leave offended. Well, the ball is not a ball, but you will not have to vandalize much. Pavel cheerfully waved a bunch of dull brass keys. Maybe we can run through a couple of offices for a seed? Great, I'm on the left, you're on the right. Lena, you're on the second floor. The big man cheerfully gave instructions and, having enjoyed the growing fright in the girl's eyes, explained conciliatingly. A joke, of course. The bundle is still one, and in any case, not a step away from each other. The floor seems to hold, but you never know what. And let's really go to the second one. The second floor was met with the same desolation and decay as the first. In some places, bricks and folds of window openings were torn out again. Star-shaped holes gaped here and there in the glass, in which the dull, but razor-sharp-looking blades of fragments gleamed predatory. Near the wall, at the beginning of the corridor, there was an old bucket. Sticking out of it was what must once have been a mop. They started checking the offices of the long wing from left to right. Max deftly and without unnecessary movements sorted through the keys. Sooner or later, the English lock yielded to pressure and turned with a dry creak. The rooms differed little from each other. In one, Lena saw bundles in the corner and decided that they were probably cards. So, the geography room, the room with the bookcases against the back wall, with the paper dust clogged, could be a study of Russian or literature. Neither paper nor wood could stand the test of time and temperature changes, everything crumbled and crumbled when touched. Maybe we can find a physics or chemistry room. What reagents, weights, visual aids? Pavel mused thoughtfully. The skeleton is in the biology room, Max agreed. Or in a loop, Lena blurted out without a second thought and shuddered. But this is superfluous, the big man noticed without a shadow of irony, no interest, and his mouth is full of problems. My tongue is sometimes faster than my head, the girl sighed guiltily. Yes, we are the same, Max smiled without malice. In the center of the wing, almost above the main entrance, the office is best preserved, at least externally. The back wall of the office was decorated in the form of some kind of living corner. Decorative stems of long-dead trees peeked out of the tubs. From the windows, surprisingly intact, Maxim's black field was visible. However, no one wanted to break windows and jump from the second floor, so they moved on. Lena became quite emboldened, and while Max was picking up the key to the next office, she slowly walked along the wall to another door. "Don't go far without looking," Max threw in her direction. Pavel was waiting excitedly behind his back, vigilantly watching his girlfriend with one eye. "I'm here," she said. To her surprise, the next door unexpectedly easily yielded to the pressure and opened. "Oh, and it's open here!" Lena shouted joyfully and poked her head inside. "Watch out there!" Pavel hurriedly walked towards her and managed just in time to catch the screaming girl, who flew out of the office like a bullet, into his arms. A second later, the magician was standing next to him, not taking his eyes off the open door. "What's there?" "The skeleton," the pale girl exhaled, "was found in a loop, damn it." "Come on," the Viking growled incredulously and went into the office. "Holy shit," he drawled sadly a second later. "What's there?" "Well, go take a look," and Lena said everything correctly. After exchanging a glance with a friend who calmed down a little, Pavel followed Max. There was indeed a rope hanging from the ceiling in the office, the loop of which wrapped around the thin neck of a skeleton-like man in half-rotted clothes. The skin hung from the bones in folds, the eyes, mouth and nose were sunken. The head really resembled a bare skull, entangled with brittle dark hair. "Is this the one?" Pavel asked, puzzled. "Yeah, they left it hanging as a keepsake." "Don't be stupid, Pash, it's fresh." "Well, relative. He managed to mummify himself for 3 or 4 years. I've read about it." "Damn, it's necessary to call the police." "Yeah," Max nodded with a sigh. "And the study is over. At least it's ours." They left the office to Lena, who was recovering. "How are you?" Maxim asked seriously, fishing out a phone in one of his pockets. "It's already fine," the girl waved her palm. "I was just scared, unexpectedly. It was a stupid joke, I'm sorry." "Yes, jokes have nothing to do with it, this friend has been hanging here for 3 or 4 years. Hugging her, Pavel reassured her. Meanwhile, the big man was fiddling with the phone. "What is it?" "Pash, call the cats, there is no network." The guy fished the smart out of the back pocket of his jeans and tried to call. "Same bullshit, Len." No one was surprised by the lack of a network on the girl's phone. "Well, then we move from here," to everyone's relief, Max summed up. "Either we'll ring outside, or we'll stop by the nearest branch. It's sad, of course, but fumbling around here with such a companion behind his back, there are no willing, I think." Lena shook her head vehemently. "We went down the corridor to the gym, deciding to use the proven way and not to climb into unfamiliar places yet." On the way, the girl noticed that on one of the broken windows, the sharp blades of the star-shaped hole were filled with something incomprehensible and darkened to an unrecognizable state for a long time. For some reason, this stirred up a slightly subsided anxiety in her. The gym was greeted with the familiar twilight and silence. Maxim, deciding this time not to leave the door a chance, immediately leaned on it with all his weight, to no avail. After talking for about 20 seconds and blushing, he shook his head at Pavel. "Come on, let's get a bunch." The door yielded no more to 2 shoulders than to 1. In the end, when the 2 friends slammed their shoulders into it together, the wall rather trembled, dropping a few more plaster tiles on the floor. So, Maxim exhaled, resting his palms on his knees. Well, apparently, after that blow, it was skewed or something fell from that side and jammed. "The kitchen," Pavel prompted, and the big man nodded. "Maxim has already demolished the dining room door with a kick without much piety. And she behaved exactly as a flimsy wooden door should behave after more than half a century of rotting in an abandoned building, that is, she flew into rotten splinters. Walking through the doorway in the wall that separated the dining room from the kitchen, they quickly found a small door to the street. Metal, tightly embedded in brickwork and locked in a harsh Soviet castle of an impregnable appearance. Max put a heavy boot into her to be sure, but no one was expecting success. "That's it, my patience is over. Now I'll need those bricks in the corridor," he breathed angrily and strode out of the dining room. When Lena and Pasha caught up with him, he was already picking up a heavier piece from the floor and trying on the nearest window. "That's it, Nar," Pavel started to calm the alarmed girlfriend, but then there was a deafening clang, a rumble and a stubborn mat. The brick that Maxim viciously launched into the already decorated with a star-shaped hole window bounced off the thin teeth of broken glass, almost hitting the knee of the thrower, and rattled on the floor. The fragments, darkened by years of dirt, were violently shaken by the impact, but they did not suffer at all. For a few seconds, the company, dumbfounded, looked at the broken window. "How did you do it?" Pavel asked stupidly. "I'll figure it out, I'll show you for the money," Max replied and bent down for another piece of brick. "Come on." He stood a little to the side and, with the movement of a baseball pitcher, threw a piece slightly larger than half a brick into the same window. The dark blades shuddered violently and rattled again. A piece of brick split in half from the impact, and the fragments rolled with a crash on the boards. "It's fine," the guy hugging the frightened girl exhaled. "Bulletproof, or what?" "Yes, only a little broken," Max snapped, picking up a new chip. "I'm going to blow the fuck up right now." However, not a single window of those into which the Viking was furiously throwing shells dropped even a tiny piece of glass. The glasses also reacted to the catchy Pavel Elena. Having thrown enough stones at the windows and even breaking several new bricks out of the openings, which also failed, Maxim sat down, leaning his back against the wall. Pavel came over and sat down next to him. The girl was standing next to him, anxiously wrapped in a denim jacket. "So," surprisingly calmly, Max suddenly said. "What do we have? The doors are locked, the windows are not breaking, there is no communication, there is no food, there is no water, and the latter is especially annoying. We think there were sinks in the kitchen, maybe there was water?" Pavel looked at her doubtfully. "After 100 years, everything has rotted away for a long time and rust has clogged. So, we think, we throw ideas," Max responded. "I don't see anything coming out." "Have you found the paranormal, and, Pash, on your head?" "We'll figure it out," with all the confidence I was capable of, the guy replied. "And you can call from the roof," the girl spoke again. "Maybe he's fishing there." Max turned to his friend. "And where are our brains? Only throw stones. We're getting old, Pavel, we're getting old." He jumped up and walked briskly to the stairs. On the landing of the third floor there was a door with a lattice of rebar and a short flight up to a small booth with a door to the roof. Both doors, to their relief, were unlocked, although there were doubts about the upper one, because Max opened it with his shoulder on the move. No one cared about the state of the castle. The trio dived into the phones. After a couple of seconds, everyone looked at each other and shook their heads. There was no network. "So, well, it's too early to panic, we probably haven't tried everything yet," Max spoke judiciously. "We think there are some obvious things that we missed." "Damn it! Fire escape." He started looking around. The guy and the girl also began to search the flat, dirty roof with their eyes, trying to find the rusty pipes of the escape ladder at the low brick sides. They were found quickly. The staircase once descended along the wall of the long wing, near the corridor connecting the wings, when it was. Now there was a short piece of one pipe sticking out of the roof and a slightly longer bent piece of another. Somewhere below, the holes of the masonry were guessed, where the support rods entered. One even stuck out at the level of the second floor. There were no stairs. Yes, Max sighed, loosened and ruffled his thick hair and rubbed his face. Okay, now you can have a little bit of panic, but dosed and powerless self-mutilation. Lena's stifled sob came from the booth with the stairs. Pavel looked back at her. What are you doing there, kid? Come to us. No, I'm afraid of heights. I'm already scared here on the roof, and it's scary near this door. I'm generally scared. Pash, what's going on? She moaned plaintively, squatting down and hugging herself with her arms. What kind of place is this? The guy hurriedly approached her, sat down next to her and hugged her, whispered something soothing in her ear. Maxim, running his hands through his hair, paced the roof. He stopped at the edge above the main entrance, thoughtfully looking down at his car. A little later Pavel came up from behind. How is she? Max asked without turning around. She's holding up fine, she's strong with me. Yes, I noticed, it's good. What do you think? There is a concrete canopy over the entrance, minus a couple of meters. Max, are you fucked up? What will a couple of meters give you? Well, some of the 6th floor fell and survived, the big man said thoughtfully. I don't know anyone like that, his friend snapped, looking down. Besides, survival isn't exactly what we want, is it? We need to leave unharmed. He suddenly looked sharply into Maxim's face. At least, Lenka. Do you understand me? Got you, old man, we'll figure something out. You can't take us so easily. They went downstairs and stood for a while in the corridor of the 3rd floor, looking at each other. Well, let's summarize. And again Maxim took the initiative into his own hands. For some unknown reason, we were stuck in an abandoned building without communication and provisions. We must admit that some paranormal force is preventing our exit. And very effective. He turned around, spun around, looked along the long dim corridor and suddenly shouted, making the girl shudder. Hey, who's there? The voice rolled into the distance, walked along empty staircases and back alleys, and when Max had already turned away from the empty corridor, suddenly came back with a clear affirmative echo response. Yes, it answered matter-of-factly in a voice not very similar to the sonorous voice of a Viking. No fucking effects. The big guy boiled up and yelled. Do you think he caught us? People did not escape from such places either. Run. The echo responded indifferently a little later, independently shifting the emphasis to the last syllable. Max somehow jerked sharply and turned sharply in the direction of the echo, as if trying to look out for someone. Pavel thought for a moment that his friend was reacting too jerkily, although the independence of the local acoustics made him freeze along the ridge. He had already opened his mouth to stop his friend, but Lena was ahead of him. Maxim, please stop. If it answers like that again, I'm probably peeing right here. She squeezed out a plaintive joke. To be honest, I'm already about to. There's a toilet somewhere, but I'm not going there alone. No one is going anywhere alone, Max answered nervously, convulsively passing his palm over his forehead and not taking his eyes off the talkative corridor. And the toilet is, by the way, a thought. He turned to Pavel. Sewage system, he clarified. Well, there must be something here, right? It's probably been dry for a long time. This, if I'm not mistaken, is at the far end of the lower wing, on the first. They hurriedly descended to the 1st floor and walked past the main entrance towards the far end of the corridor. Lena remembered the plastic bottle of water in the door of the field a few steps away from them. The thought was not yet painful, but she involuntarily ran her tongue over her dry lips. When will they start seriously suffering from thirst? By the evening? At night? The thought of spending the night here suddenly rose in front of her at full height, obscuring everything else. An abandoned building with an incomprehensible force living inside that keeps them here. A mummified body in one of the cabinets, it is unknown what is in dozens of others. As Max said, then more bodies were found? How many died within these walls? How much is left in them? Her lips trembled and her throat was completely dry. Now the memory of the water in the car became painful. And what if those who came here did not want to commit suicide at all? At first, a voice whispered insinuatingly in her head as she hurried after her friends down the corridor. But then, dying of thirst, locked up here with the locals. A picture of a window with sharp shards filled with something dark appeared before her eyes. What if later? She walked down the corridor, trying hard to hold back tears. A short corridor in the end wall led to the toilet. They passed a wide window facing the facade. The window was dark and cracked. Pavel elbowed him on the move to be sure and hissed through his teeth. The glass wasn't going to give in. The vestibule corridor ended with a doorway, behind which there was a concrete wall. To the right and to the left were corridors without windows, at the end of which new doorways could be seen. Boys to the left, girls to the right, Max joked darkly, and all three moved to the left, to the door with the letter M. The toilet was an ordinary concrete box. Against the wall opposite the door was a small raised platform, in which 4 round holes were black at regular intervals. A sloping stone chute ran along the wall to the right, also diving into a hole under the elevation. The children lived civilly, Pavel appreciated. Max looked appraisingly at the dark holes. "I can't fit through," he remarked a little guiltily. "Pasha, too, will not fit and will not climb." Lena clung to the guy's arm. The big man looked at the girl's narrow shoulders. "Don't even think about it," Pavel immediately declared. "He said not to split up, I won't let her go there." "No, it's just me," out of inertia, I waved my hand. Max, no chance anyway. Even if there is some kind of pumping well, which I strongly doubt, it is still closed with a grate or hatch. And considering what kind of glass there is. He waved his hand wearily again and walked to the complaint. "Does anyone mind if I'm the one for the intended purpose?" Pavel carefully pulled his hand out of Lena's hand and, after exchanging a glance with her, followed. "I won't come out," the girl warned and turned away. Then the roles were reversed. Hearing the sound of the zipper being unzipped behind him, Max asked uncertainly. "Maybe this, at least I should get out?" "Just try it," the girl responded angrily, rustling her jeans. "I won't die of shame, but I can even die of fear. Did we take any weapons at all?" "Well, I have a knife." The Viking patted the case on his hip. "And you, Pash?" "And I have Max," the guy answered without a hint of a joke in his voice. After the toilet, they carefully checked all the windows on the first and second floors, but did not find any through which they could climb without cutting themselves to death. Fragments of glass swung in flimsy-looking wooden frames, but they sat firmly, like the teeth of a shark's mouth. Suspicions about dark spots on the glass beams below turned into confidence in Lena's head. Someone was rushing out, mindlessly shredding his own body in the relentless blade of dark fragments, and she strongly doubted that this someone succeeded. But did this someone really want to get out, or was it just a way? I was glad at least that they no longer bumped into each other. The office with the hanged man was carefully avoided. Maxim said that the windows there were definitely intact. After all, the three of them were standing by the window in the study with ornamental trees. Dusk was gathering, I was thirsty more and more, but hunger did not bother me yet, nervous tension affected. The field was black a few meters below. "You know what, guys?" Lena said a little sluggishly, looking at the car, "Let's lock up all the offices, huh? Overnight? Otherwise, if I think that there are a lot of open doors in the corridor, from which something can come out in the dark. I'll be gray by morning." Max nodded and jingled a bunch of keys, pulling it out of his pocket. "You're not the only one, let's go." One by one, they locked the offices, even picked up the key to the office with the hanged man, and this calmed down a little. They gathered again in the study above the field, where darkness was already gathering. They moved the sides of the tub with trees and sat down against the wall. Lena leaned wearily against Pasha, feeling more numb than sleepy. The twilight outside the window quickly flowed into impenetrable darkness. Night had fallen over the abandoned building. "I'm thirsty," the girl said hoarsely. "Don't talk about it," Max answered hoarsely from the darkness. "It will get worse. Max, maybe tomorrow we can try to disassemble the floor on the first floor? Well, you never know, suddenly into the basement and from there. Yes, it is unlikely that the basement communicates with the study rooms. Did you willingly change the subject, big guy? If only from time to time there is a hole somewhere, can I look for the smell?" There was almost no smell even in the toilet, Pavel muttered sadly. Yes, even if there was. Lena still sounded sluggish, but already sleepily. "If there is even a chance that you can get out through the floor, you will not break the most rotten board. There are few glasses." The office was drowned in silence. "Max, did you say there was a flashlight?" Pavel tore it up again softly. "There is," he agreed. "I won't turn it on unnecessarily, you never know. By the way," he fidgeted, picking at his pants, and a second later dispersed the darkness with the light of his smartphone. "Come on, cut down all your bricks, they are now searching for a network, the batteries will quickly kill, and we may still need the opportunity to call. Or maybe take some pictures. Corridors, a couple of offices." Pavel offered to fish the phone out of his jeans. "Or maybe it's not necessary." Lena hastily jumped up. "I'm there if I see something paranormal, I'll jump off the roof myself." "Another one," her boyfriend grumbled, settling back against the wall and laying his girlfriend's head on his lap. "First one looks at the visors, now this cigar has gathered. Tie it up for me. Maybe that's how this building works?" The girl spoke softly in the darkness that had come again. "You know how scared I was, up there on the roof. You are standing at the edge, looking down, saying something. And I thought, what if you're down now? And I'm alone here, with these glasses and this there." She shuddered, and Pavel hugged her as best he could. "Well, no, that won't happen. I won't leave you alone." They must have all been forgotten in the end by a light, anxious sleep, from which they were rudely torn out by a sound unthinkable in an empty abandoned building in the depths of the night. But there was a sound, and, pulling the tired trio out of a shaky dream, he seemed to be walking with sandpaper over their already stretched nerves. The sound of uneven shuffling footsteps from the corridor to the right, and from somewhere at the farthest edge of the wing. Awkward, cautious steps, as if someone was dragging his feet along the corridor in the distance. Then there was silence, in which all three froze in tense poses. Lena pressed her hand to her mouth so as not to cry out, and yet barely restrained a strangled moan when a light rumble echoed down the corridor. There was no need to guess about its source. Someone was shaking the locked door of the far office. Once, twice. After a short pause, the footsteps resumed, slowly began to approach. Pause. The noise of a door that someone was tugging at in the dark, trying to open. Steps in their direction. It was as if someone was moving, shuffling his feet, and methodically checking all the doors in the corridor, one by one. "Max!" Pavel hissed hoarsely. "Max!" In the dark, it was hard to see what the big man was doing, but he did not respond, although it was clear from the rustle that he had woken up, like them. "Max, lock the door." The guy groaned faintly. There was a noise and a fuss, the light of a lantern flashed and immediately disappeared, which Maxim put with glass directly on the floor. In the remaining reflections of the light, he could be seen with trembling hands tearing a bunch of keys out of his pants pocket, trying not to ring too much. The appearance of the mighty Viking now was strikingly different from his usual, almost always unperturbed and confident state. There was pure, indescribable horror in his face and movements. His eyes were popping out of their sockets, his breathing was hoarse and uneven, it seemed that he was about to have a stroke. And yet it was the same Max who always did everything thoughtfully and carefully. Kneeling down in front of the door, he waited for a second, calming the trembling in his hands, then took a deep breath and began swiftly and silently sorting through the lonely keys, trying to turn the lock. The key is smoothly inserted into the well, pressed, smoothly removed, folded back and pressed without ringing. Next, the rustle of footsteps, the noise of the door. The key is in the well, press, take out, flip. And a new one. The rustle of footsteps, the noise of the door. It was like some kind of wild, almost insane competition, a game where something vital was at stake. Sanity? Life itself? Pressure. Throw it away. Rustle, noise. When the door of the next office trembled, Lena bit into the flesh of her palm until it hurt, crushing a heart-rending panic squeal. The footsteps slowly moved towards their door. The offices here were located with entrances to each other, they were separated only by a faded timetable board. Max still had a dozen keys. Smoothly into the well, push, flip, new. Probably, everyone tried not to think about the fact that it was already possible to miss the right key simply because the lock is too tight. The footsteps stopped in front of the door. Key in the lock, push, turn. As soon as the key smoothly slipped out of the keyhole, the door was violently shaken. Then again. The rotten wood cracked, and for a second it seemed to everyone that the one on the other side would just pull the tongue out of the flimsy decayed wood and finally enter. But after a long pause that seemed like an eternity to everyone, the footsteps resumed. A little later, the door on the left trembled. Lena sobbed soundlessly into her bitten palm, shuddering all over. Pavel hugged her tightly and pressed her to him, trying to somehow protect and calm her down. Max was kneeling in front of the door, as if before an altar, looking at it in horror and disbelief and clutching the key, which was found when it was almost too late. "What is it?" Pavel whispered faintly, looking at his friend with horror. "What's there?" The big man just shook his head. Meanwhile, the footsteps approached the next door and faded away. Instead of the already expected rumble, the quiet creak of the opening door shackled everyone with a new horror. After all, it was locked in there, the guy wheezed, squeezing his silently shuddering girlfriend in his arms. "You locked it." Max nodded uncertainly and suddenly stood up abruptly. The footsteps in the corridor rustled again, clearly heading for the opened office. "This is the one where the hangman is," Pavel remembered. The Viking nodded again and with a confident movement pulled the spring knife out of the case. The click of the blade fired from the hilt showed everyone the roar of a pistol shot. "What are you?" the guy jerked, but Maxim already grabbed the knife by the blade and handed it to him with the handle forward. "Just in case." He spoke softly, but no longer in a whisper, and put the knife into his friend's automatically outstretched palm. "What are you up to?" Pavel asked just as quietly, suddenly feeling a little bit of confidence. Although it was hardly a matter of the knife, rather that Max became like himself again. "Why were you scared?" Max asked with emphasis. "Steps, weak twitches. And what if there's some kind of drunk, a tramp or someone else found a hole that we missed, and fumbles around? I'm getting out." "Are you freaking out?" Pavel jumped up. "And what if they're—" "Who? Well, who?" The big man raised the lantern and shone a beam at the door. "The shadow of Hamlet's father, that fucking hangman, a puppy who broke down and got into a noose. The windows don't break here, the doors don't open when it wants to. Do you think the door would have held him back? Do you think he, the bitch, decided to play cat and mouse? I didn't give a shit about his games. If he wants to say something, let him say it to his face. The inflamed Viking quickly opened the lock with a prepared key and went out into the darkness of the corridor. As once, probably, real Vikings walked on the deck of an enemy drakkar, boarded in the middle of cold waves. Hey, where are you? Who are you? A loud voice rang out in the corridor. Come on, get out. There was a kind of deathly ringing silence, in which the horror suddenly became so dense and tangible that it seemed to Pavel that he could cut it with a knife clenched in a palm wet with sweat. Lena, having lost her last strength, leaned against her friend's shoulder in a semi-wetted state, listening to the sounds from the corridor until her ears ached. It was the pain in the ears that the barely audible shuffling footsteps of someone leaving the office where they found the mummified body of the hanged man echoed. Then there was an uncertain, inarticulate sound that Max made, something like a strangled exclamation, in which Lena thought she heard strangled. You? And a quiet, familiar echo from the upper corridor, sounding almost a question word. Run. Almost immediately, there was a crisp rustle and a fractional stomp. Then the silence was torn to shreds by the deafening roar of an old metal bucket swept away, apparently by a strong blow, which rattled for a long time and rolled down the corridor between the wings, fading away. Lena couldn't stand it and screamed, thin and frightened. Pavel jumped up and shielded her with himself, clutching a heavy knife in his hand and trying not to think about how a razor-sharp blade as long as a palm could help him against what was outside. And outside, the light of the lantern was still swaying, darting back and forth along the corridor, slightly retreated, accompanied by the heavy crunch of thick soles on dusty rotten boards. He returned, darted to the door and soon rested on the floor near it. Maxim followed slowly and awkwardly, wiping his face with uncertain movements. It seemed to Pavel that it was wet with sweat. Having entered, the big man looked a little peevishly at the terrified couple and put the lantern with glass on the floor. He closed the door and carefully locked it with a key. What was there, Max? The guy asked tensely. The man stood for several seconds without turning around, resting his forehead against the door, as if gathering his thoughts. Nothing, he said in an even voice in the end. There could be nothing there, Pashka. So there was nothing. What are you treating me for? Pavel pressed irritably. If there was nothing, then who pulled the doors? What kind of noise was there? Who spoke? Don't shout, Max responded just as evenly, wincing, and finished with the arrangement. Me. Nothing, not. I saw it. Are you convincing us or yourself? Lena asked in a weak voice after a moment of silence. Myself, probably, the Viking calmly acknowledged and stretched out his hand for the knife. Pavel, clicking the button, folded the blade and irritably threw the weapon to a friend, whom he now looked at almost with dislike. Maxim put the knife in the case on his hip, sat down against the wall and wiped his face with his palm again, taking a deep breath. Then he extinguished the lantern. I need to think about it. In the darkness, his tired voice sounded with an unusually pleading intonation. Morning is more complicated in the evening, like. Calming down a little, the guy still standing on his feet asked. Something like that, Max replied. There's nothing there now, that's for sure, Pash. Lena, I was looking, the lantern is striking far away. Let's rest. The couple fidgeted, settling back against the wall, and soon silence reigned in the office, as in the whole building. Only now no one knew how long it would last and how it would be broken next time. And yet fatigue and nervous tension again took their toll. And the company woke up already from the color pouring into the murky dark glass of the office. Groaning and groaning, they got up from the floor and stretched their stiff arms and legs. Lena discovered that she had bitten through her palm at night, and Max busily treated the wounds with antiseptic and carefully applied a bandage. Silently, Pavel looked at his friend curiously, but did not press. He had already recovered from the night shake-up and understood that Maxim was not one of those people who would withhold critical information unnecessarily. The night incident was not mentioned at all by mutual tacit consent, trying to somehow come to their senses, looking at the real world behind the impregnable muddy windows. Lena looked long and wistfully at the field standing under the windows. "Let's check out the kitchen, or something," as if reading her thoughts, Max suggested. Well, what if? The handle of an old mop was lying in the hallway, broken in half. The crumpled bucket was lying against the wall, almost at the passage to the short wing. Pavel looked at his friend inquisitively, but kept silent. The taps in the kitchen gave way with the effort of strong hands, but at first nothing happened. When the trio was about to leave, one of them in the sink farthest from the door suddenly hummed low, shuddered and spat out a clod of something reddish-maroon from a bent tube. Lena thought it looked more like a half-rotted piece of secretions than a rust plug. Following the clot, a sickening stench burst into the kitchen, from which her eyes watered, and the girl jumped out into the dining room, barely restraining dry vomiting spasms. Max hastily turned on all the taps, and they all left the dining room together. Then the silent Viking went to the gym, where he planted a door into a room with sports equipment and spent some time noisily messing around there. The guy and the girl stood thoughtfully in the middle of the hall, holding hands, like schoolboys who had a bad day. "The dust is alone," Maxim spread his hands guiltily, showing himself in the doorway. "Everything crumbles under your fingers like a grid of this." Pavel nodded, not particularly surprised, and they stood looking at each other. The silence became strained, uncomfortable, unusual for two old friends. "Okay," Maxim ruffled his hair. "Okay, let's go to that office for now, I'll tell you everything on the way. It's not easy. When I was at school, I was still a freak, to be honest," he suddenly gave out when they left the gym. "It's already settled down at uni, my head started working, and so. Well, it's great, what do I do? No one will say a word across, even the teachers were afraid. But what about school? Where alpha is, there are omegas, of course. We had one." The big man hesitated, nervously ruffled his hair and slouched. All flimsy, whining. They bullied him as they wanted, mocked him. And he didn't do anything, just whined and snot. "Do you understand, Vile?" Infuriated terribly. "And one more thing." Maxim turned back a little startled. There was something wrong with his joints, hip. He wobbled like that when walking, twirled his back like a faggot. Sharkle. Lena prompted almost tiredly. "Yes," after a tedious silence, the Viking confirmed. "Shuffled. We took the bag from him, threw it to each other, ran away from him. And he couldn't run, shuffled after and whined. But he could have gone to the teachers or done at least something. He suddenly cut himself off, realizing that they were looking for excuses, and we were throwing and shouting with the bag." Maxim swallowed. "Run, run." They entered the office above the entrance, and Max turned to Pavel and Lena. "It's disgusting to remember it now. I had completely forgotten. Well, outgrown, changed, really. Pasha, well, you know me. I mean, wait." Pavel played with the muscles on his cheekbones. "Did you drag us to a place where the same puppy was hounded to the noose, knowing that you have the same story behind you?" "Yes, I didn't remember it at all," the big guy jumped up. "I'm telling you, it's been a long time, and I tried to erase everything from my memory. I started remembering something when that damn echo suddenly said run. Well, and at night." He ran his hands through his thick mane again. "I learned these steps simply. That's how he walked, dragging both legs." "What did you see?" His friend asked him harshly. I don't know, Max began and almost shouted out, looking into Pavel's darkening face. I don't know, Pashka. It came out of that office to Devisilnik. Like him, it's a shuffling gait, but it doesn't seem to be. Skin hanging, face, skull. I keep thinking, maybe this is a nervous breakdown for me, huh? Well, I imagined it. And Bucket has a nervous breakdown. Lena said sleepily, sliding down the wall on her haunches. She got scared and ran into the corridor. Yes, Maxim? It is. He continued uncertainly. She looked at me. Run? He asks. And then? I don't know, it was like it was on all fours. Elbows and knees, like the joints of a spider, stick out in different directions. My legs are completely twisted in the hips. And as he rushes along the corridor into the darkness, I didn't even have time to follow him with a flashlight. On the floor, on the walls, on the ceiling, the bucket was blown away. And that's it. He gasped and spread his hands helplessly. That's all I saw, guys. Everything? Pavel suddenly asked sharply, taking a step forward. That's not all, Max. Do you want me to tell you everything? He was stepping on a big man backing away, who suddenly seemed to have fallen off abruptly and shrunk in size, retreating between the desks to the blackboard. Do you even remember what happened to that kid you were bullying? Did he get into the loop too? I don't know. I don't even remember what grade he went to with us. Maybe they transferred it. Or maybe not. Or maybe he is too, just not so obvious. You brought exactly the same shit here with you, from which everything started here. You know, this thing needs you. Pavel was already yelling at Maxim, who was taken aback, pushing him in the chest. She's keeping you here, okay? He's playing with you. And Lenka and I got to the pile under the hammers at the same time. We'll die here all according to yours. That's enough. The girl's quiet voice from behind made the guy shudder and turn around. Stop talking nonsense. Wearily, she pushed off the wall and stood up. From the sight of her, all the anger instantly disappeared somewhere, and Pavel felt a painful tenderness squeezing his heart. Over the past day, almost nothing has remained of a warm, sleepy girlfriend from the back seat with a slightly sexy husky voice and cute tangled hair. A tired, thirsty and fear-ridden girl was looking at him, spots were darkening under her eyes, her hair was even more tangled, but they no longer gave the thinned face prettiness, but only intensified the tired and lost look. Something too decayed here, he remembered. Over there, across the office from us, a corpse has been hanging for several years. Lena pointed her finger at the wall. Just dangling in a loop. He needs to be buried somehow in a human way or something. Remove, lay, cover with something. Lord, at least read Our Father over him, I don't know. What if it helps? Pavel turned to his friend, and for a while they looked at each other from under their brows. Then the guy shook his head and rubbed his face with his hands. Max, you. I'm sorry, I snapped, he managed. Really, it's all nonsense. I've known you for a long time, you're a normal guy. You never know what anyone did at school, we were all not angels there. I'm just crazy. Because of all this, because of the night tricks, because of Len, I made up shit. No, you're right, the big guy started, but Pavel interrupted. I'm not fucking right, he snapped. Whatever it is, it's like in that book at King's. Fears are dragged out of the head, rummaging in the brain, and it is still unknown what he will dig up in my rotten things. Max, I'm sorry, he held out his hand, and the Viking, after only a moment, pressed his palm into it. Okay, old man, never mind. Over his friend's shoulder, he cast an almost familiar, almost calm glance at the girl. Are you ready to visit Arzmer? Near the open door to the office with the hanged man, Max visibly became nervous, but pulled himself together and stubbornly entered first. I stood inside for a long time and was silent. Pavel and Lena followed him in and didn't say a word either. There was nothing to talk about, the office was empty. In silence, they returned to the almost familiar room with decorative trees and a black field under the windows. Lena pressed her forehead against the cold glass and almost thoughtlessly looked at her, trying to understand how the familiar and reasonable world can be so close and so unattainable at the same time. At the thought of water in a bottle, her throat cut dryly, her cracked lips hurt, and she diligently drove it away from herself. Her bitten palm ached. Pavel walked from the door to the window, ruffling his hair on his head, going over in his head at least some options for salvation, but nothing sensible came to mind. Instead, stupid thoughts about school crept in, unpleasant situations, fights, resentments were recalled. No, he never purposefully participated in harassment, but who knows? Max was sitting under the board, leaning his back against the wall, and twisting the heavy handle of a spring knife in his hands. And it was he who broke the prolonged silence after half an hour. The car keys were the first to rattle on the floor, rolling to the feet of the puzzled, frozen Pavel. "So that's it, fighters," Maxim Royce calmly said in his pockets. "Listen to my brilliant plan." He threw out a flashlight, medical supplies and documents from his pocket, carefully placing them in front of him. "So far, the only sensible and plausible version we have is yours, Pashka," he said evenly, sitting down more comfortably. "Namely, an unknown creature smelled scum in its house, like the one that gave birth to it. I woke up and decided to play. You two have nothing to do with it, which means it is logical to assume that you will suffer and die for nothing. Personally, I see only one way out." "What are you talking about?" Pavel took a step towards him, but Max abruptly put a knife to his chest. "Stand still." He threw it briefly, literally pinning his friend to the floor. It was the same Maxim who did everything clearly and carefully, and the guy had no doubt that the tip of the knife was now looking right into the heart. And one click of a button, a click and... "In short, we do this," the Viking said with a sigh, looking thoughtfully in front of him, and corrected himself. "You do. When I'm done, take your things and get in the car. I think he'll let you out. Jump in and get the hell out of here. Leave my carcass here. Firstly, you won't even restrain me together, and secondly, it may not give up. It's not worth the risk. Is everything clear?" "Max, this is nonsense," Pavel spoke hurriedly. "You can't do that. Wait. It's the atmosphere that's putting pressure on your brain, do you hear? I can't think coherently either, old man, but that's not the way out." "And what is the way out?" Maxim asked wistfully, looking into his eyes. "From dehydration to bend over here, wait for what else this creature will come up with next night, eat each other at the end?" "Maxim." " Lena gave a weak voice from the window, and the big man turned to her. "Lenka, I'm sorry, I didn't think that like this. Pash, I'm sorry." And he clicked the button. "Max!" Pavel shouted, rushing forward, and the big man already folded the knife back with a click and threw it at his friend's feet. "Take it too," he said hoarsely, falling over on his side. "You never know." A crimson stain was spreading on the Viking's chest. The blood swelled in the wound in jerks, gradually subsiding. Pavel fell to his knees beside the still trembling body, not knowing what to do. He pressed his palm to the wound, but almost did not feel even the beating of blood there, let alone an unmistakably punctured heart. Max's eyes have already stopped, have become numb. The guy hurriedly pressed his hand to his neck, but there was nothing there, except for the still warm elasticity of the trained body. There was no pulse. "Max!" He groaned, impotently thrusting his fist into the rotten wood of the boards, not noticing how thin splinters hurt the skin on his knuckles. "Max, bitch, what have you done?" Lena sobbed softly behind him, and the guy seemed to switch. He began hastily stuffing the things laid out by the leader of the group into his pockets. He did not touch the documents, knife, bandage and napkins, deciding that they were no longer needed. "Lena, let's go." The guy hurriedly jumped up and walked to the abandoned keys from the field. The girl stood beside them, covering her face with her hands and looking with horror at the defeated Viking. It still couldn't fit in her head that this huge and strong man, who had recently seemed indestructible and unflappable, a man whom her friend, without a trace of irony in his voice, simply called his weapon, was now lying like this, in a pool of his blood, dead. It was so unreal that even in the midst of what was happening around, it seemed wild and implausible. "Lena, Lena." Pavel gently shook her by the shoulders and forcefully turned her away from the lying Max. "Come on, we have to go, do you hear? What has been done cannot be returned, and we may really have a chance. Come on." He took her by the hand, and she, as in a dream, followed him through the door, to the stairs and down to the main entrance. There Pavel hastily grabbed the rusty bolt and pulled it on himself. He didn't move. "Which one?" The guy exhaled and pulled harder, but nothing changed, and the girl suddenly realized with a dull wave of apathy that had rolled over her that nothing had worked out. It shouldn't have worked like this. And it didn't work. While her boyfriend was rushing and tearing the skin on the bolt, trying to shake the door a little with his foot, this confidence was growing stronger in her. "I probably just got weak without water," Pavel suddenly exhaled. "To hell with this door, let's go." He again dragged her by the hand to the corridor, where, grabbing the first piece of brick from the floor, he threw it out of the window with all his might, instinctively turning away from the fragments. Lena did not turn away and therefore perfectly saw how the stone hit a narrow sickle of dirty glass and bounced off with a clang without even scratching it. "No," the guy shook his head, desperately looking around. "No, no, no, not like that. It shouldn't be like this." "So?" The echo objected to him, again responding to the screams ringing under the high arches. He grabbed a new piece and threw it through another window, then another. "No, no, no," he shouted, throwing stone after stone at the indifferent glass. "What do you want, bitch? What do you want? So that we all die?" He suddenly froze, knowing full well what he was going to hear in response, and the echo did not disappoint. "That's it." It readily agreed a little later from the far end of the corridor. "Wait." Pavel froze, clutching at a thought that suddenly came to mind. "Wait, I get it. He's not dead. That's why nothing has changed. He missed. Wounded, but alive, right?" Lena looked longingly at her friend, knowing perfectly well that this was wrong, but she could not take away at least a glimmer of hope from him now. "We're there, bandage, now stop the blood. He is a healthy moose, he will pull out and there we will see who is who. Come on." Lena was in a hurry again, barely keeping up with her tightening hand. Corridors and staircases replaced each other, as if in a nightmare, where they probably were. Her throat burned, and her stomach tightened with vomiting spasms every now and then, but she was still crushing them. They ran into the office with the trees, and Pavel rushed to the lying friend, but immediately stood rooted to the spot. They stood there for a while, like students who were late for class. Then the guy let out a strangled groan and grabbed his fingers in his hair. There was no body. There was a small brown, already dried puddle on the floor and bandages with napkins. Dom took what he wanted. Lena wearily knelt down and began to cry without tears. The guy incredulously walked up to where Maxim's strong body had been lying a few minutes ago. He carefully touched the blood on the floor with his fingers, looked back at his shuddering girlfriend and did not say a word. After some time they were sitting under the window from which the car was visible. Pavel cradled the girl who had fallen into a stupor in his arms and whispered soothing nonsense in her ear, in which he himself did not believe. Lena didn't hear much of what he was saying anyway. Before her eyes was a picture of a half-full plastic water bottle in the back seat of the field. Then in the morning the sun's rays fell on her through the window and threw lively, cheerful highlights into her eyes. A drop of this water still chilled the corner of her lips when she got out of the car. Then the water bottle was suddenly replaced by a picture of blood pumping from Maxim's chest, and she was confused. She buried her face in Pavel's knee in a dry vomiting urge, but could not get anything out of herself, only shuddered painfully several times. And at that moment Pavel suddenly understood everything and instantly made up his mind. Flax. Cautiously, he called out. Len, listen, I have an idea. We need to get up, let's go. Why? She moaned into his knee, recovering from the spasms. I don't want to go anywhere else, anyway already. No, listen, I think I understood. The guy was slowing her down, forcing her to get up. Come on, I'll show you everything on the roof, come on. And she again obediently trailed after him along the corridors and stairs, beginning to think that somehow she would die like this, without even noticing the difference, continuing to measure the decayed floors with uncertain uneven steps. Along with the others who stayed here. Twilight began to gather outside the windows for the second night in the terrible building. When they got out on the roof, the fresh air brought her to her senses a little, and she pulled her palm out of Pasha's hand. I won't go far, Lena shook her head. I'm afraid of heights, I told you. I know it's stupid now. No, you just don't have to go anywhere. Well, I mean, listen, he said, carefully retreating to the edge of the roof, I told you, Max is ahead. He got it right. Only, damn, he was, well, a normal guy, he didn't think of it. Pash, stop, Lena said tensely, looking at how her friend was getting closer to the edge of the roof from the facade. You listen, well, that's right, the guy hurriedly continued, starting to rummage in his pockets. And here it keeps those who have driven others to suicide. It's obvious. What did I do? I yelled right in Max's face that we were going to die here because of him. I pressed him mentally and broke him. That's the thing. Pasha keeps me here now, do you understand? Pasha, no, don't you dare. Suddenly the girl shouted in such a voice that her friend shuddered. This is all bullshit from the very beginning. And Max is yours, and you yourself, you've got something wrong. That's it, Lenka, all 1-to-1, Pavel shook his head sadly and threw the car keys at her feet. Are you going down to the door now? No. You'll go, because there's a concrete canopy over the entrance, it's 2 meters with a hook. Yes, 3 floors, the ceilings are high, but there is a chance. You're going to go downstairs, get in the car, and go get help. Don't you dare touch me, only doctors are like that. Pavlik, no, the girl groaned faintly, kneeling down and helplessly scratching the dirty surface of the roof with her nails. Don't leave me here alone, you promised. You also have to promise me something, Lenka, he said seriously, looking into her eyes. Right now, do you hear? She shook her head helplessly and stretched out her hand to him pleadingly, unable to find words. 3 floors of a gloomy building full of unknown nightmares suddenly stood behind her like a dark monolith, in which she would have to walk alone. For now. While he is. You promise me to survive, because I don't want to do it in vain, Pavel poked his finger behind his back. Promise me now. I promise, the girl mouthed soundlessly, losing her last hope and not a bit believing in what she was saying. I'll survive. Now go, the guy swallowed. Hurry up, but be careful, take care of yourself. Keys. Take the keys and go to the car. Go ahead. Torn from her knees by his desperate cry, she grabbed the keys from the roof and jumped into the gap of the open door. The stairs met the gathering dusk. Lena hurried down, staggering, grabbing the walls and railings. Vivid scenes of her slipping and breaking her leg on the stairs were spinning in her head. It remains to lie here, waiting for the night and new steps, and from which even the imaginary barrier of the decayed door will no longer protect, while her beloved person dies outside, on the concrete canopy over the entrance. Already running up to the main doors, Lena heard a thud from somewhere above, and from this sound she almost broke from her knees, and she convulsively grabbed the rusty crossbar of the bolt, grabbed the short handle and pulled with all her might, turning the bolt in the rusty ears of the metal door. She could already feel the old rusty crust bursting from her jerk. As the rod rotates around its axis, it frees up space for itself to move outward. A painful jerk that nearly dislocated her shoulder brought her back to reality. The bolt did not move a millimeter, still forming a single indifferent hole with the old door. Lena stared at him incredulously for a few seconds, then pulled again and suddenly let out a cry that frightened her, more like a cry of birds than a sound born of human, albeit withered, vocal cords. The girl hit the metal door with her whole body, randomly pulling the bolt back and forth, coughing out inconsolable cries from her sore throat. Unsuccessfully. Staggering, she rushed into the corridor, grabbed a piece of brick and threw it at point-blank range at the glass, without even trying to cover her eyes. The fragment casually bounced off the cloudy glass, scratching her cheek. Throwing back her head, Lena let out a long, agonizing howl, in which her last strength seemed to dissolve and sink into the growing darkness under the arches. No! The dreary call flowed through the corridors, staircases and offices, awakening in them a little surprised, but quite confident echo. No? It asked from one side, then from the other. No? Why not? A familiar insinuating voice finished in her head. That's right, that's how it should be. She stared thoughtlessly out of the darkening window, having lost the last connection with reality, completely not understanding how all this is possible. How she was left here, in this abandoned scary house, completely alone, without an unflappable, confident Viking, without such a dear and close Pavlik. Pasha. Lena flinched, as if from a slap in the face. He's there now, on the ledge, right under the windows of the office, maybe alive. Staggering like a drunk, sliding over the broken bricks, she went back to the stairs. On the threshold of the office, the girl froze, unable to bring herself to go to the window and see the broken, bloody body of her beloved there. And yet she went, forcing herself, unknown to her, to take step by step to the muddy window, covered with years of dirt. And the window is still transparent enough to show her what the fall from the roof onto the wide concrete canopy over the main entrance did to her peacock. And she took it step by step, painfully peering out. Here the roof of the car appeared, the edge of the visor hiding its passenger side. Lena hesitated a little and took another step, then, without realizing by what forces, another one. It seemed to her that a semicircular edge of a dark spot loomed on the dirty concrete, and she could not remember if there had been such a spot before when she looked out of the window at the car. I couldn't remember. You remember, the insinuating voice said reproachfully. Another step, and the spot became more visible, more distinct. Of course she remembered. There was nothing there. The dry, dusty concrete of the old shed, over which a pool of blood was now spreading. The semicircular edge of the puddle resembled the curved blades of broken glass in windows. He was just as ruthless and relentless. Step by step Lena approached the window and, no longer surprised by anything, looked down in a heavy stupor at a wide puddle of blood, black as the approaching night. The puddle is too big to leave at least an imaginary hope that the person who shed this blood remained alive. Especially when there was no body in it. Lena didn't know exactly how long she stood there in apathy, without thoughts and feelings. At some point, she suddenly realized that the cloudy glass of the window was getting dimmer, filling with darkness too quickly for normal twilight. Then, just as apathetically, she realized that it wasn't the glasses, it was the whole world around her that was narrowing, squeezing her from all sides with creeping darkness. Staggering, she turned away from the window, ready to face what had come for her, for the last one. But she saw something completely different, although she could not say that it surprised her. In the middle of the office, an empty rope loop hung neatly tied from the ceiling. Waiting. Lena took an uncertain step towards her, and then the darkness completely enveloped her, and the girl finally lost consciousness. The loop was the last thing Lena saw when darkness came. And she was the first thing her eyes found when the darkness parted. Although the expression was too strong. Dusk had deepened, and in the unlit building behind the dirty windows, darkness had almost come into its own. And yet the light stroke of the rope hanging from the ceiling was clearly visible. The girl swallowed and immediately coughed. The speech in the dried-up throat, torn by screams, was almost unbearable. But the same pain suddenly reminded her that she was alive. Still alive. And one more thing. I'll survive. Despite her thirst, her body still had enough strength to get up from the floor. Staggering, Lena approached the loop and put her fingers, bandaged palms, into it. The skin was tickled by the prickly fibers of the rope. Absolutely real, more real, it seemed to her, than anything else around. The loop hung very comfortably. There is no need to trust your life to rotten chairs. Jump up a little, grab your hands higher, pull yourself up, stick your head in. The girl saw very clearly for a moment how she was struggling for the last crumbs of air, barely touching the floor with the toes of dusty sneakers, which would scratch the boards weaker and weaker until they stopped altogether. That's what you want, right? She asked hoarsely, looking at the loop. That's how it works here. Everyone by himself, the loop tacitly agreed. The girl's hands fell powerlessly to her hips, and she jerked from the sudden pain. Looking down, Lena was surprised to see the ribbed edge of Maxim's spring knife sticking out of her jeans pocket. The girl couldn't even remember properly when she managed to put it there, convulsively collecting things thrown to her by Pavlik. The thought of Pavlik stirred up a dull pain and despair in her chest, and she slowly pulled the heavy handle out of her pocket, held it in her palm for a while, and then almost thoughtlessly clicked the button, firing the blade, and with a quick, strong movement slashed at the hanging loop. From the first time, the strong rope did not give in, and she swung the knife again, turning the inviting ring into two uneven tails, which were now swaying puzzledly under the useless loop. "Fuck you, okay?" she hissed in a broken voice. "I'm still alive." With a dry click, folding the blade, she wandered to the exit, not really knowing what to do next. The corridor was met with an even thicker darkness than what was left in the office. And she stood in the middle of it, quickly losing the courage that suddenly woke up in her for a few seconds. Ahead was another night in the building, alone with an unknown evil force, which, as it was now clear, did absolutely not care what he had done in the past. She needed everyone who entered, to do only what she herself had done in the past, one way or another. An uneasy sense of danger thickened along with the darkness, made me stone my back under the feeling of a look from somewhere behind. The open door of the office behind her suddenly began to instill in her an absolute horror. The thought of going back there and spending another night in a familiar place flashed through her mind, but she immediately rejected it. What will happen to her if in the pitch darkness she suddenly hears how hard Max is fumbling at the wall, or how Pavlik quietly knocks on the window outside, asking her to let in? Lena shuddered painfully, finally losing the remnants of courage. And she almost forced herself to look around, already expecting to see someone's silhouette in the doorway, but she saw something that scared her much more. It seemed to her that it was impossible to be more scared, but how wrong she was. The doorway of the office was empty, but this did not bring relief, because the door of the next one gaped open in a rectangle nearby, and the openings of those offices whose doors she could see from where she stood, pressing her hands to her spasmodically contracting chest, shone with the last crumbs of daylight. All the doors of the offices were open, either waiting for her to enter them herself, or ready to let someone out of them. Elbows and knees, like the joints of a spider, stick out in different directions, Maxim spoke in her head. My legs are completely twisted in the hips. No, it was for Max. What will come out to her to push her to a final decision? Her Pavlik, terribly broken and bloody, with sharp fragments of ribs sticking out of his chest. A downcast Maxim with a dark spot on his t-shirt, or... She shuddered, or a whole parade is waiting for her. Everyone who has ever inadvertently or curiously crawled into this concrete Venus flytrap. All of them are here now, having crashed in a desperate jump from a high roof, cut inexorable fragments of glass, broken bones in panic throwing up stairs, or just quietly exhaled their last breath, having lost faith in salvation. And, of course, hanged. Those who accepted the silent invitation hanging from the ceiling loop. I'm alive, the girl whispered faintly, almost pleadingly, not feeling the strength in these words. Her legs, now against her will, led her to the door to the office where she had once found a skeleton-like body of a hanged man. And she did not understand why she was going there, but step by step she approached the dimly glowing opening with the remnants of the evening light, expecting every second that someone's shadow would flash there. That the owner of the loop would come out of the door to meet her, shuffling and dragging his feet. Maybe he will reproach her for waking him up with her inappropriate joke and obsessive curiosity. Finally, she will explain that it is she who causes what is happening, and not at all the careless words and actions of her companions. But no one came out. Still fainting from the sticky horror, Lena looked inside and whined softly. An empty loop hung indifferently from the ceiling in the middle of the office. The girl turned away and staggered thoughtlessly into the darkness of the corridor. The twilight that enveloped the buildings also engulfed her mind. She hardly remembered where she was going and for what. The pain in her throat was almost unbearable. Lena tried to swallow or cough, but in the end she just burst into tears without tears, making the same bird plaintive cries. They circled in the dark, returning with a strange echo, as if somewhere nearby someone else was screaming in an inhuman voice, either teasing her, or screaming with her in pain and despair. To her surprise, Lena came to her senses in the middle of the gym. Apparently, without realizing it, she came to where it all started from. In the darkness of the two-story hall, next to the tall windows, as if the apotheosis of everything that had happened, instead of a rope with an empty loop at the end hung from the gloomy high ceiling. The girl already trudged towards her without resistance. The old mats were slightly springy underfoot. A sprawling pile of rotted rope clung to his legs. A little jump, pull up, and Lena suddenly remembered that she had once been one of the few girls in the class who could climb to the very top under the cheers of Fittrick. And this was the only place where the painful fear of heights left her, because she did not look down. Looking back means looking into the abyss, and it's always scary. She was looking up to where the rope was tied in a tight, thick knot near the ceiling. She had a goal, and she didn't stop until she touched it with her palm. The withered lips were painfully cracked, stretching into a smile. "I'm alive," the girl whispered to the loop and, jumping up, grabbed the rope. In the first second, she decided that nothing would work out, that she simply did not have enough strength. But they were found, appearing either from a dried-up, but still young and healthy body, or from those depths that she herself had never suspected in herself. Time after time, catching her hands on the barbed rope, moaning from the pain in the aching bitten palm, and she pulled herself up again and again. When the legs were finally able to catch on the dangling lower end of the rope, it became a little easier. Sometimes Lena, apparently, fell into the twilight of consciousness again, but her hands and feet did everything by themselves, until she suddenly realized that she was hanging from the ceiling, looking at the knot. It was smaller than the usual rope. His hands were shaking from the effort, but his fingers gripped the rope with a death grip. Having more conveniently intercepted the too thin support with her feet, Lena gathered her strength for a few seconds, and then unclenched the fingers of one hand and carefully pulled the knife out of her pocket. The blade clicked dryly, shooting out of a narrow slot in the end of the ribbed handle. The jerk of the heavy blade almost twisted the weapon out of the tired, numb hand, and Lena convulsively squeezed it. And it seemed to her that even in the thickening darkness she could see dark spots on the knife. The blood of Maxim, who would never have done this to himself if he had not been deceived, convinced that everything was over for him. It seemed to her that she felt the warmth of Pavlik's hand, which threw her this knife, standing on the edge of the roof. He, too, would never have taken that step if he had not been deceived into believing that there was only one way out. All lies. The truth is that. "I will survive," Lena said hoarsely and angrily, and slashed with a razor-sharp edge under the knot. The rope swelled, unfolding with a whisk of cut fibers and, unable to stand it, burst. The short seconds of the fall seemed almost euphoric to the girl, and she flew, turning her back forward, watching the knot slowly receding from the ceiling. She saw the wind tossing her tangled hair over her face, the rope curling in rings next to her. Even the pain in her parched throat and the pain in her cracked lips seemed to recede for a moment, leaving her floating in gentle weightlessness. With a last conscious movement, she threw the knife aside. And then the weightlessness disappeared, and a heavy blow in the back knocked her out of consciousness. When Lena came to, the tall windows still gave some crumbs of ashen light. And she decided that she had been lying here, among the scraps of old rope and the remains of decayed mats, for a very short time. The back of my head ached, my throat was already aching as usual, my lips burned, my bandaged palm ached, but nothing hurt anymore. And that scared me the most. What if she now lies here motionless, waiting for the night, the footsteps, death? Almost forcibly Lena forced herself to clench her fist in her hand and felt that her hand would disobey. Then, carefully, slowly, the girl lowered her hand to her jeans and ran her fingers over the fabric on the inside of her thighs. And she read somewhere that with a spinal fracture, a person can wet himself. The jeans were dry and stiff, like her throat. Lifting her head, Lena found the tips of her sneakers with her eyes and, suppressing a fit of horror, forced herself to move her foot. A white flare loomed encouragingly in the dark, swaying. The girl breathed a sigh of relief and rolled onto her side, knelt down and immediately howled with pain, which pierced her back with a sharp rod and almost threw her back on the dusty mats. She caught her breath and, trying to keep her back straight, carefully got to her feet. Apparently, the fall still did not pass without a trace for her spine, but she could move and walk, and that was the most important thing right now. Standing up and twitching from the pain in her back, Lena gathered the rope, which, to her surprise, was still lying in tangled rings near the place where she fell, and trudged to the exit from the gym into the darkness of the corridors. The echoing gloomy vaults and dusty staircases plunged her into a half-sleep again. A couple of times she imagined that she could see vague figures in the open doors of the offices with her peripheral vision. It seemed to the girl that the rustle of her footsteps was echoed in the dark not only by a self-willed echo, but that somewhere nearby, as if someone else was right behind her. But she didn't turn around. To look back is to look into the abyss. The roof greeted her with a gust of fresh wind and a dull pink streak of sunset on the horizon. It came to her mind, almost confidently. She walked to the edge of the roof, where a bent piece of pipe protruded from it, which had once been the beginning of the fire escape. Throwing the loop over the bend, Lena leaned back with all her weight, crying out in pain, and the loop squeezed the unusually cold and hard prey with a familiar grip. Exhaling sobbing, the girl threw the rope over the edge and froze, gathering strength. She had no idea how she would go down with such back pain and whether her spine would hurt even more. I didn't know how far the rope was enough and from what height I would have to jump to an overgrown, but still covered with concrete or asphalt yard. She couldn't even be sure that the rope wouldn't just disappear in her hands, disappearing into thin air as soon as she was over the edge of the wall. But she knew for sure that such a habitual fear of heights suddenly disappeared without a trace now. Because her goal was down there, and she wouldn't stop until she touched it with her palm. The abyss into which it was impossible to look was now behind her, and Lena was not going to look back. Carefully, trying not to disturb her back, she swung her legs over the edge and began to slide down a little, transferring her weight to the rope. She cut her fingers and did not think of disappearing into thin air yet, sending her on her last flight to Earth. As recently in the gym, the girl carefully moved her hands along the rope over and over again, watching the rows of brickwork float past her eyes one after another. The thought came to mind that the rope could have disappeared while she was lying there unconscious. That cheered her up a little. For some reason, the one who hosted here decided to wait for now. My legs stopped feeling support somewhere at the level of the second floor. For some time Lena was sliding down on her hands alone, frantically clinging to the rope and trying to shorten the distance to the ground by at least another 1.5 meters. Finally she realized that she was hanging almost at the very end. Something dark loomed at the edge of her vision, and turning her head, the girl realized that she was hanging very close to the window to the second-floor corridor. Somewhere nearby was the entrance to the office with ornamental trees in tubs, a puddle of Maxim's blood on the floor. In the darkness of the corridor, something suddenly moved. With growing horror, the girl watched an awkward, brittle figure move from the other side of the window. After a few moments filled with sticky horror, Lena realized that the figure was not approaching from the corridor, but coming straight out of the depths of the murky and dirty glass, to which she was now turning and resting her hip against the wall, hanging face almost close. The figure, emerging from the dark depths of the impregnable window, changed and floated, alternately taking the shape of a hanged man, then a limping teenager, then a brittle Pavlik. In the end, the face of a teenager about 12 years old appeared before her eyes, tired, haggard, with greasy bangs falling on her face and eyes full of endless fatigue under it. Fatigue and something else. Some demanding question that Lena suddenly understood. "Because you can't do that," she whispered to him almost soundlessly. "Because that's not the way out. Anyway, this is not the way out. I almost feel sorry for you, but you were wrong." She stared into the demanding tired eyes for a moment longer, as if asking why she was hanging on the wrong end of a noose. "Because as long as you're alive, you haven't lost," the girl finally said and unclenched her fingers. And she tried to group up and land with a roll, but her back hurt, and of course, nothing happened. The ground hit her legs like a battering ram, throwing her sideways. His left thigh exploded with fire, which immediately echoed searing in his back. Lena fell into the dry bones of the tall grass, miraculously without knocking out her eyes, tore her elbow and cheek. When the pain allowed her to inhale, the exhalation escaped from her withered throat in a long, agonized cry. And yet she was alive, and she was outside. In front of the porch of the main wing, behind which Lena was now lying, there was a black field with a half-full bottle of water on the back seat. Not far away for a young strong girl, whom she had been for almost 2 days. Almost in another universe, for that lump of pain and weakness that was shuddering now in tearless sobs in the middle of the broken grass. But she had a purpose. Lena quickly abandoned the idea of getting up. My left hip ached mercilessly and seemed to be starting to swell. Then she crawled. Leaning on his good leg, painfully twitching from shots in pain in the spine, grabbing bunches of hard dry grass and pulling himself further and further over and over again. The grass pricked her torn palms, and sometimes the girl imagined that she was climbing up the rough rope again, to where there was a tight knot of rope under the ceiling. At some point, the bound consciousness left her again. The journey became like swimming in the middle of a night storm. The girl was a ship lost in the ocean, which now rose to the peak of the wave, then fell into the abyss between two black waves of pain in her back and hip. Diving down, it was as if she was burying her nose in dark water, which was pain. The wave swept over her from head to toe, demolishing feelings and thoughts, sweeping away consciousness, as a wave of water sweeps away superstructures from the deck and breaks masts. But again and again Lena was surprised to find the strength to climb a new peak and from there see somewhere far away in a stormy night a tiny lighthouse fire. Black field, water, life. She had a goal, and she wouldn't stop until she touched it with her palm. When the dark waters parted, Lena was surprised to find herself standing near the driver's door and frantically pulling the handle. The handle clicked uselessly, reminding me of the indifferent and inexorable bolt on the main door. The girl stared blankly at the impregnable barrier. It feels like somewhere in the already forgotten depths of consciousness, such incredibly strange, familiar logical chains are being launched. The car is locked, the key. Lena froze, realizing with horror the inevitable. The key must have fallen out of the pocket of the denim jacket when she fell to the ground, or fell out while she was crawling. He's out there somewhere, in the dark, in the middle of dry prickly grass, at the bottom of a dark ocean of pain. But her hand, despite the agonizing horror that the thoughts flashing through her head caused, had already slipped into her pocket and came across a cold plastic box there. After half a minute of improbably everyday fuss, Neva habitually buzzed the alarm and clicked the locks, blinking orange turn signals encouragingly. Crying out in pain like a bird, Lena pulled herself into the driver's seat and almost immediately forgot about everything except the water, which suddenly became so real and incredibly close. No longer paying attention to the pain, the girl reached for the bottle, convulsively tore off the lid and greedily clung to the ribbed neck with her lips. It had never occurred to her before how much could be contained in such simple and familiar movements, in convulsive contractions of the tongue and throat. Never before have the words water and life been so identical, almost indistinguishable to the brain. "Don't drink everything," Pavlik carefully suggested from the back seat. "You'll be sick, Len, slow down." Having made an almost impossible effort on herself, the girl obediently took the coveted neck from her lips and breathed often. It seemed to her that she felt the walls of her stomach greedily sucking in the long-awaited liquid, as the blood thinned, as the body filled with life. Then came the agonizing convulsions, but she managed to move herself and not throw out the treasure she had just drunk back. Along with life, feelings gradually returned to her. The night was filled with the rustle of grass, the chirping of invisible insects, the barely noticeable touches of the cool night wind. Somewhere in the distance, it seems, the engines of cars on the highway were barely audible. She didn't have to look in the rearview mirror to make sure the car was empty. Memory obligingly showed her the crescent-shaped edge of a dark puddle on the dusty concrete. To look back is to look into the abyss. Lena took a few more big greedy sips and carefully screwed the lid on. Turning the key made the dashboard light up with multicolored lights, out of place, reminding of the garlands on the Christmas tree. Suppressing a hysterical laugh with difficulty, the girl turned the key further. The starter buzzed cheerfully, followed by a reassuringly smooth and strong engine grumbled. Lena pushed the gas pedal with her foot several times, listening to the confident howls. She knew how to use a manual transmission, but she could hardly imagine how she would squeeze the clutch with her foot, whose thigh was now stretched by the fabric of jeans and burning with fire. First, she fastened her seatbelt, twitching a couple of times at the same time from the pain in her back. At the thought of how stupid it would be to crash in the dark right now, having gone through everything that had happened, she almost burst out with another hysterical laugh. Helping herself with her hands, Lena put her left foot on the pedal and tried to push, but only helplessly howled in pain. Despair tried to come back and re-enter its rights, but there was no place for him anymore. Taking several deep breaths, the girl grabbed the gearshift lever with one hand, and pressed the knee of her left leg with the other, simultaneously trying to somehow push the clutch pedal through her. In the midst of the swirling whirlpool, she felt a metal plate give way under her foot. Convulsively yanking the lever, she managed to turn on the first gear and even by some miracle in time to give gas, starting the car from the spot. The field rolled on the ground with a rustle, crushing the dry grass with its ribbed wheels. The abandoned building puzzled her with dark gaps of windows. Sobbing in pain, Lena hurriedly turned on the high beam and sent the car to the gate. It was impossible to go in the first gear of the det, so it was necessary to switch at least once again. And she was pretty sure she couldn't do it twice more. Picking up speed for third gear, the girl clenched her teeth and tried to steer the car as smoothly as possible into the goal. And then she let go of the steering wheel and grabbed the lever again, with all her strength, pressed her other hand on her knee, and her foot on the clutch. A cry of pain drowned out the howling screech of switching. The car went jerkily, but Lena almost thoughtlessly pushed her forward with the gas pedal, again grabbing the steering wheel. And she was almost too late. The wheel plunged into an invisible pothole in the dark. The field swerved playfully and almost drove straight into a metal pole on which a door welded from rebar hung. Twisting the steering wheel at the last moment, the girl screeched into the lapping with the sash, which swayed and tore off the side mirror with a crunch. There was a clang from behind, and she was outside the gate. The car confidently ran over potholes, forcing the driver to cry out in pain every now and then, but still carrying away from the relentless clutches of an abandoned complex, from a nearly protracted loop. Lena glanced at where the side mirror had been recently, and still coughed a dry, angry laugh. Rearview mirrors were no longer needed now. To look back is to look into the abyss. The target was ahead, and she wouldn't stop until she touched it with her palm. Because as long as you're alive, you haven't lost. Friends, if you liked the horror story, please do not forget to like it. I will be very pleased. Thank you.